Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fall 2019 inauguration of the Helix Center. I'm glad everyone could be here on such a beautiful day. My name is Jerry Hurwitz. I'm Associate Director at the Helix Center. And today we have a roundtable on the topic of lying. Before we commence, I want to mention that on October 5th, our second roundtable is on the mechanization of mathematics. So let me go on and introduce our esteemed panelists today. First of all, unfortunately, Patricia Churchland, who was scheduled to be on our panel, fell ill and was unable to make it today. But we do have a fill-in. Martin Garbus, if you would raise your hand so we know who you are, is here. He's an attorney and has taught at several prestigious law schools in the U.S. Dr. Anna Ballas, if you'd raise your hand, is Associate Professor of Clinical Psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College and a training and supervising analyst at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. She's been in private adult and child psychiatric practice in Manhattan over 35 years and is a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. Neil Garrett is a Henry Wellcome Research Fellow in Cognitive Neuroscience at Oxford University. His research centers around aversive behavior and learning. As part of this, he has led a new line of inquiry examining the role of emotional adaptation in decision-making. And I think he's going to tell us more about that today. Emma Edelman-Levine is an assistant professor of behavioral science and the Charles Merrill Faculty Scholar at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. She was recently recognized as a rising star of the Association of Psychological Science in 2019. Emma studies the psychology of altruism, trust, and ethical dilemmas. Dr. Francis X. Shen is the executive director of the Harvard Mass General Hospital Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior, an instructor in psychology at Harvard Medical School, senior fellow in law and applied neuroscience at the Harvard Law School Petrie Flom Center, and an associate professor of law, McKnight Presidential Fellow, and faculty member in a graduate program on neuroscience at the University of Minnesota. Jonathan Stray is a computational journalist at Columbia University, where he teaches the dual master's degree in computer science and journalism and leads the development of Workbench, an integrated tool for data journalism. He's contributed to the New York Times, The Atlantic, Wired, Foreign Policy, and ProPublica. And sitting on the panel as well to help moderate is our executive director, Ed Nersessian. So thanks very much. Okay. Well, I was thinking, just to get the ball rolling, about, and not to have this start out necessarily on a political line, although I'm sure that's on several of the minds of our audience today, that part of our founding mythology includes, of course, the truth-telling traits of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and both known for their honesty, of course. And that also brought back to my attention a wonderfully humorous television commercial some years ago where Honest Abe was sitting in his bedroom and Mary Todd Lincoln, portrayed in the commercial, I don't know what she really looked like, as being a little portly, was getting dressed in a dress. And she turns to Abe and she says, "Do I look fat?" And Abe turns and looks at the camera like, oy vey. What am I going to say? So, of course, lying is something, even for George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, everyone has engaged in at some point. So I guess the question is, why is lying a problem, or when does lying become a problem? So I'd like anyone to sort of jump in.
I can think about your example a little bit. Not going to quite answer your question, and instead think about when lying isn't a problem, but maybe that creates the blurred line of kind of when it's not a problem and when it is. Right, so if you ask most people, like, what should a person say when someone who can't change asks how they look in the dress, they'll say, you should lie. The right thing to do is to lie. And if you ask people, would you wanted to be lied to if, you couldn't change, if there was no time to institute feedback, they'd say, yes, I want to be lied to. And so we actually have all these implicit rules that we think a lot of lies are ethical, a lot of lies can build trust, a lot of lies we seek ourselves, right, at the end of the life, when we're vulnerable, when we can't institute change. And so there is this whole category of lies that, most people agree are good. And then, I think maybe other people can talk to this more, right? That blurs the line of then, well, when, how do we figure out when it's no longer good?
I'll take a shot at this. So a framework that I sometimes use is to think of communication as persuasion, right? And so we have this idea in a democracy with a free press, we should be able to persuade each other that we're right. But we also have these ideas about what types of persuasion are legitimate. So if you look at advertising, if you look at politics, all of these different fields have sort of developed norms and sometimes laws. So for example, you can't pretend to be someone else, right? If you publish the same message and pretend to be a political candidate falsely, if that candidate had said it, it might have been perfectly fine. It's generally frowned upon to try to use psychological manipulation of various sorts, right? So if you know something about the psychology of the person you're trying to persuade that they're perhaps not aware of, then that's considered illegitimate. And so there are all these categories beyond simply speaking an untruth. Many of them are fairly well developed and consistent across a lot of fields.
Yeah, I just sort of want to link to something that Emma said there, which, and Jonathan as well to some extent, that, lying, there's just so many different types of them. And how we categorize them, I think to some extent gets to this question of, who are the beneficiaries of the lie and who are the ones that are harmed. So, like, Emma's totally right. Like, when kids start to lie, we often, to some extent, think that's a good thing in certain circumstances. Like, if they're given a present that's terrible, we want them to say, wow, thank you, what a fantastic present that was, So that's a context where we think lying is a good thing, but then there are other lies which are actually illegal. Like, if I go in somewhere and pretend I'm a police officer, if I lie under oath, there's a very clear signal of society that is not okay because they have a law against it. And I think the reason for that is because, people are harmed by that. You can potentially frame an innocent man and it has all these sort of consequences, whereas in the present example, it's actually benefiting most people from the lie. So, in theory, you could take each lie on a sort of case-by-case basis, or take a sort of utilitarian perspective and say, who is getting harmed, who is benefiting from this lie, and use that as a sort of measure of whether it's a good or a bad thing.
I'm a lawyer, and I deal with the creation of lies. Honest people tell honest stories that I made up to achieve a certain social justice end that I perceive. And if faced with the issue of whether there should be a truthful answer or an answer that pursues my concept of justice, the decision for me is an easy one. Mm-hmm. And if you are part of a system of law, which is a system of lying, and you seek to achieve a certain goal, you first have to accept that that's the structure of that system, and then you decide what to do. I just spent some time down on the border where immigrants were trying to get into the United States through the Trump regime. And they will ask questions, and the whole question of truth and how they answered them became very significant. Their lack of awareness of truths, for example, if they had been raped a year ago, then the government concluded they were damaged then and should not have waited a year to come into the United States. If you looked at the damage, you could say the damage was there a week ago. So then if you're faced with a witness like that, who's going to go before a judge, you have to decide, or somebody has to decide, or there has to be some input as to what that witness's answer is. The truth a year ago, or the truth, the damage is there today.
There are some
It would be
real...
very helpful if you would speak not to each other, but speak to the person who is farthest away from you in this room. It is very difficult to understand you.
Project.
I'll do my best.
Several of the answers have suggested that, well, there are certain times that it's a problem because the law says it's a problem to lie. But if you take a step back, you have to ask yourself, why has the law determined that certain instances it's problematic to be deceptive or to not tell the truth, and other times we allow it, whether in the name of national security or in the name of justice or in the name of something else? So that's one challenge. Your original question was, when is it a problem to lie? Setting aside that bigger question, which maybe we'll get to, it is the case that, again, coming from the law, if Honest Abe had to answer that question under oath, he can say oy vey, but he has a duty to do a certain thing, whereas he may strategically decide, I don't want to tell you the truth. So once inside a courtroom or inside generally legal proceedings, there are some added complexities that we have sort of socially determined should be there for one reason or another. And we even use the word fact finder for a judge or a jury. And if, for instance, they have to figure out whether or not Mary Todd Lincoln was obese or not, they want to know, all the information that they can. And they rely on witnesses hopefully being at least purporting to be honest.
Well, it's interesting just to quickly jump back on the issue of him, Abe having to answer that question under oath. Of course, there's another wrinkle to it, which is he's the only one who knows whether she looked fat. So even under oath, he might be able to. It's just another wrinkle. I mean, you're right to point out that under oath, people are seen to be compelled to say the truth more. But in certain instances like this one, where it's a piece of private information that is not shared with anyone, in this case, whether or not she looked fat to him, he could continue to lie, even under oath. So that's another wrinkle to the whole issue of lying.
Or he could love her so much that to him, she didn't look fat. So we as analysts are concerned with the subjectivity of people's perception. And also, when are they lying to themselves? When are they lying to others? And also with children, what do we teach them and how do they learn to be truthful? That's a whole other dimension. We're very interested in both people's motivation for being truthful or lying, and also how that develops as they grow up. So, for instance, when you asked that question about Honest Abe, it made me think about the Hans Christian Andersen tale of the Emperor's New Clothes, where everybody said, oh, these clothes are absolutely magnificent, and it was a little child who said, but he's naked. So the little child hadn't yet learned to be an obsequious courtier. And in that sense, he was truthful. So that's a very interesting story about what we teach our little children and how do they grow up to be truthful or liars. And also how do they grow up to be tactful versus ruthlessly brutal in their statements. And there's a lot to be thought about on that.
One thing I think is confusing for children is, right, one of the things we tell them is if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all, right? And there's this kind of comfort, I think, in the law, too, with this distinction between omission and commission, right? We can all go around not saying anything to my wife, changing the subject, saying something, your eyes are beautiful, I've never seen you look happier, right? We can create these statements that are technically true or technically non-lies that still allow a person to be deceived, and that's what makes it easy for us to justify deception, engage in deception without feeling too guilty. But something interesting that I've found is that targets of deception are really not sensitive to these differences. So I go through great mental gymnastics to figure out how do I deceive this person without explicitly lying, because somehow I know lying is bad. But you've been deceived. You don't really care how I did it, right? The victim of a deception in negotiations or the victim of even kind of false positive hope doesn't care that you didn't explicitly say an untruth. They care that your intention was to deceive.
The question of intention is really interesting. When I teach this, and I ask the students first thing, how would you define a lie? And we get, I'm sure if we went around this room, 50 different answers. And one of the big breaking points is whether or not intention is required. And this gets to your point. If one subjectively, truly, honestly believes something, but it is objectively false, and there's wonderful research by a number of psychologists on this point. One from Beth Loftus' group many decades ago now. She can implant, sort of quote unquote, implant a memory of seeing Bugs Bunny at Disney World. And you'd never see Bugs Bunny at Disney World because, at different companies. And these participants in the research studies will swear up and down that they remember seeing Bugs Bunny at Disney World. Same thing if I misremember who the 5th president of the United States was. Am I lying? I didn't intend to, right? I intended to actually give the right answer. How do we categorize that? And I'm sure we all have different answers for that. But of course, it gets to your question to begin with. What is a lie?
Yeah. I think that also gets into the idea of this difference between deception and self-deception, right? And there is this theory that, humans and animals and even, viruses have evolved to self-deceive. And we think the reason for that is if I want to deceive someone, I give off a lot of telltale signals. My voice might contract, my eyes will, my pupils will dilate, my fingers will start sweating. So all these signals can be read if I am telling a lie with intention there. But if I actually believe that lie myself, if I actually believe that I'm fantastic, that I've got all these amazing superpowers, if I actually really believe that, then those telltale signals that I give off aren't there anymore. So if that intention isn't there, then I'm better able to deceive others. So there's this theory that actually we've evolved not to have that intention there in some cases so that we can sort of are better able to sell better versions of ourselves to others around us.
And of course, people like actors are, especially good at it. I don't know how many of you remember Peter Sellers. He was a wonderful comedic actor, and he died rather young of a heart attack. And when I read his obituary in Time magazine, it was Time or Newsweek, it was saying how when he got into a role, he couldn't get out of it. He had this kind of a little bit of a quality of as if, what we call as if personality in our language. He just couldn't get out of it. And he was superb, at it.
Yeah.
Also, if you talk about young children, they're so suggestible. So this is kind of a tricky subject that also has connections with the law, which is, for instance, young children who are molested. And, since I'm a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, work with kids, the whole issue of truth and falsehood in the area of trauma is something that's of great interest to me. So we have an old analyst, Ferenczi, from a long time ago, who wrote a paper about, it's called Confusion of Tongues Between Adults and Children. And one of the things that he describes very eloquently is the way when children are molested, let's say a young child, often the perpetrator is someone like an uncle or someone in the family who knows the kid and says, oh, this will be our little secret. Don't tell anybody. So not only does the child have the trauma, but they also then have the burden of secrecy and kind of borrowing the guilt of the grown-up and having to collude with them. And so it's really terrible. And then, because we're analysts, when it comes up in the analytic situation, it gets very complicated because these feelings get revived in the treatment, and then they're not sure about, well, can I trust the analyst? Are they going to do bad things to me? So the whole thing gets recreated in that situation. So anyway, that's just, it's a very complicated matter. And a lot of people get caught up with trying to figure out, well, There was a scandal, for instance, in the late 80s, I think, where all these nursery school teachers were accused of molesting little children. And to this day, we don't really know whether that was true or not, because the way that children were interviewed by the cops, who were not terribly knowledgeable about child development, was so suggestive that the kids complied, and they said, yes, yes, these things happened, and we don't know.
Yeah.
So when it comes to, just one other point about this, when it comes to truthfulness, I think that especially children, let's say under the age of 5 or 6, are very malleable about what, not because they can't perceive the difference between truth and untruth, but because they're so much at the mercy of the authorities, either because of their wish for love or fear of punishment. So it's always very problematic to put a young child on the witness stand, or to rely on the testimony of a young child, unless you understand who it is that has kind of, if you will, brainwashed them. And then if you extrapolate that to more suggestive, malleable personalities, then some grown-ups can be like that too. People talk about PTSD, Stockholm Syndrome, people who as adults are very brainwashed to tell whatever they're supposed to tell. And then there are, of course, other people who are much stronger and don't give in. So there is a question of coercion when it comes to lying. Okay, that's a whole other topic now.
Well, let's say there's a tendency in terms of natural selection towards suggestibility or self-deception, I would imagine it's not something, well, I believe it's not something that everyone has inherited equally, that there are people more suggestible and less, and there are people who are better at suppressing or not having those feelings that often are associated with telling lies. And in the extreme, think of psychopaths as being very, not responding to lies and telling lies without any sort of physiological effect. So what do you think about the idea that there may be different types of people, that we could sort people in this regard?
That's a great question. Maybe I can mention a study that I've done that maybe speaks to this point to some extent. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, so we run a lot of experiments in the lab where we actually can see how willing people are to be dishonest to someone else. And what we've looked at is how this changes over time and how it varies with people's emotional reaction when they choose to be dishonest. So we're able to measure their emotional reaction by using one of these machines called an fMRI scanner, so that can show you in brain regions associated with emotion what your emotional reaction is when you choose to be dishonest. And what we found in our study was quite interesting. We found that, first of all, people started being dishonest by a small amount. And when they were being dishonest by a small amount in those early days, they had a really strong emotional reaction in brain areas like the amygdala, for example, which we know is important for emotional processing. But as we gave people more and more opportunities to be dishonest, we saw that the emotional response decreased, and we saw that their lying subsequently increased as a consequence. And that's consistent with other studies that have shown that emotion is really important for sort of governing how dishonest we're willing to be. So, for example, if you give students beta blockers, which is a type of pill which lowers your emotional response, cheating will increase on a test that you give those students, because when that emotion's not there, sort of restricting people's dishonesty, it seems that people are more willing to be dishonest as a result. So we think emotion's really important for governing how dishonest people are willing to be, and that really speaks to this point of individual differences. Maybe some people, whether it's by nature or by nurture, just have stronger emotional responses than other people, and that allows some to be more dishonest than others. Mm-hmm. But one of the sort of, I suppose, alarming points of our study is that this emotional response seems to decrease in everyone through a process which we know, a brain process called adaptation. So that's a process we know that happens with lots of sensory information, for example, so with smells. If you buy a new perfume, for example, you might initially put a couple of drops on, and you'll smell it really, really strongly, okay? But after a few days, you won't smell it as much. So you need to put a bit more on, right? Emotions do the same thing. So when we start off being dishonest, we have a really strong emotional response. But through this act of repetition, this emotional response will automatically adapt. It will decrease, and as a result, we can be more dishonest as a consequence. So I suggest if you just put people in a context where you give them lots and lots of opportunities to be dishonest, even if they initially have a very strong emotional reaction to that, and that will sort of stop them being very dishonest in that situation, by giving them lots and lots of opportunities, this process of emotional adaptation would take place, and there's a good chance that their dishonesty will increase as a consequence of that.
So it feels
The more you lie, the more you will lie.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
It feels to me that we are sort of inevitably circling around the idea of truth. And so I wanted to maybe say a couple things about that. There's this idea of an epistemic virtue, that is, virtues or rules of thumb or moral commandments that deal with knowledge. The most concise statement of this is, I only want to believe those things which are true. But then we have the problem of, well, okay, how do we determine whether something is true? And as the flyer for this event pointed out, we mostly rely on secondhand knowledge. I and my colleagues are in the business of producing this sort of secondhand knowledge. And it's kind of a complicated process, right? There are standards for reporting. So I do a lot of work with statistics and data. There are all sorts of issues about the validity of statistics and the sorts of analyses that you do. There's the issue of reputation. So, part of why you should believe what I write is because I was right last time, or maybe because you haven't heard of me being wrong, which is not quite the same thing. And then there's transparency. Part of how I can build trust with you, hopefully, is to let you in on my process. What are my reasons for believing this is true? In the era of the internet, this has actually gotten a lot easier. I can do something like link to the court filings that I'm basing my story on. I could maybe include an audio recording of an interview if the source will consent to that. But a lot of the time, it sort of has to come down to reputation, because it's difficult to put that whole process in a story. If you're doing a complicated statistical analysis, most people aren't going to be technically equipped to go through that line by line anyway. And there are many important stories that can only be got by anonymous sourcing, right? So people won't tell you certain things unless you can guarantee to keep their name out of it. And I think every field has some complicated construction of truth, right? Why should we believe what a lawyer argues at trial? Why should we believe what you say in your paper? But the processes by which we actually produce these truths remain opaque. And this is almost a definition of truth for me. Rather than asking about, in some abstract way, is this true or not, I try to ask, what is the process by which this community decides what is true? And so that's one way of getting at it. And, that can go wrong in a lot of ways, right? There's self-deception in every field.
What about bias?
What about bias? I knew you were going to ask me this eventually. Yeah. One of the challenges with the whole topic of media bias is that there isn't really a ground truth. Of course, articles can have factual errors, but as anyone who's gotten into this fight knows, there are a number of problems with trying to distinguish fact from opinion, and there are a number of problems with deciding which facts are relevant. So, to take a sort of really glaring example, right? You might be talking with someone who says, Trump is terribly racist. Okay, well, what has he done that's racist? And you will get a list of things that he's done or said. And then you'll just get into an argument about whether those things are racist or not. So you're not really contesting the facts at that point. So media bias suffers from this problem of it's very difficult to establish a ground truth of sort of what objective journalism looks like. Having said that, what you can do is you can do analyses of political leaning, right? So does this story talk about a subject in a way that a left-wing person would talk about it, or does it talk about it in the way that a right-wing person would? And you can do this in various ways, such as, for example, frame analysis, right? So if you have a story about policy or poverty, to generalize greatly, on the left it's considered to be a societal problem or the fault of the environment in which the person grew up. On the right, it's more commonly considered to be, they're lazy or they weren't educated enough or so on. So you can do these types of things, and when you do them, you find the results are very unsurprising, right? You find that the New York Times is slightly left of center, and Fox is farther to the right, and MSNBC is farther to the left, and it's not really a shock. So I think we can all perceive these political biases already. I'm beginning to wonder if maybe we're asking the wrong questions about media bias. I mean, beyond the sort of straightforward factual issues, which admittedly sometimes is a problem, I wonder if a lot of the conversation around media bias is sort of a proxy for the hope that media figures will wage our political battles for us, which, depending on your theory of journalism, either is or is not their job.
Yeah, interesting.
So maybe I can sort of ask a provocative question related to that. Is like, do you think truth is sort of under threat? Because, you used to have these select media heavyweights, that had that reputation attached to them. These certain papers, certain TV channels that provided news. But now the barriers to entry of entering this world are like plummeted, right, with the internet. So there's just so many sources out there, like the reputation thing sort of dissolves to some extent. Do you think that's a problem?
I think we are at a very interesting moment for authority and trust. And so I'm interested to hear about your trust research. So I can say a couple things. So trust in journalism is at a historic low. It started decreasing before the transformation of the internet, so the 1970s. And no one really is quite sure why. Of course, there's various theories. Trust in American institutions in general is at historic lows at this point, so maybe it just piggybacks off that. For a long time, one of the classic critiques of media was that it's just a few powerful people and they're not really representative. So we wanted to tear down the gatekeepers, and we did. And now we're, I think, relearning the role of gatekeeper and what sort of value they provided. I'm optimistic, actually. I think a lot of people are pessimistic about the concept of truth. I'm more optimistic than that, and I think in part that's because I have a certain amount of professional visibility into the institutional processes that are springing up to try to combat this. So, for example, the Wall Street Journal has a 21-person team to deal with AI-generated fake imagery, right? They don't do this every day, but they have their committee of experts, and they have their policies and standards. So I have a very privileged position in some way in that I get to see the way that various types of media and technology institutions are gearing up to deal with these problems. And I don't know, it's hard to say if that will be successful or what even success would look like, but I can tell you that there is a response, right? It's something, it has become a field of endeavor.
Just thinking about this idea of trust, I think it's complicated because many of us think about trust and truth as intrinsically linked, but for lots of people, they're not. So I can trust you and want to affiliate with you because you make me feel good. You give me the content that I want to hear that supports my worldview, even if I recognize it might not be truthful. So, right, so we can choose friends and engage in partner selection around kind of beliefs about loyalty and emotion and benevolence, like whether this person supports us, that have nothing to do with truth. And so I think that's, relevant to how we think about media and how we think about choice of leaders too, is, right, there might be a recognition recognition that maybe this isn't truthful, but what I look for, I think it's hard for many to believe, like in news, but in a leader is not necessarily truth. It's other things that are important to kind of living the life that I want to live, and that can drive trust nearly as much, sometimes more, than kind of a belief in honesty.
I think an old and very interesting piece of literature that addresses these concerns that's worth revisiting is 1984. Which I reread sometime within the last couple of years. And it's fascinating because the protagonist, it's a sort of negative utopia. They're trying to hide the truth rather than, but they do it in a very systematic propaganda way. And he's trying to figure out who he can trust in this place of profound mistrust. And the person who he thinks maybe has a common thinking with him ends up being the person who's trying to get him to betray himself and then eventually gets brainwashed. I mean, it is a pretty gory story, but it's kind of a real illustration of how desperately people want to have that sense of someone they can look up to and connection, and how that can then be misused and exploited. It just, I know it was written a long time ago, but I think it's pertinent, perhaps not so much to our place, but just to think that such things exist. And I don't really know what's going on in China, for instance, and how much is it still the way they try to block things to have one official message, and everything else gets forcefully suppressed and so forth.
Don't you think people still can make a distinction between someone they might like or want to affiliate with, or whose perhaps minor lies they can abide by, with someone that they can recognize in distinction of that, people who are really truth tellers? Like that they're, like, for example, I can recognize when, I like to think, can recognize when a story is fair and balanced, and I can recognize when I think it's biased. And I think people make those distinctions. I'm not so sure the public is concerned to make those distinctions at large.
Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, coming back to this trust versus truthfulness, so that's a really key distinction that's made in a book that's come out recently by Steve Martin and Joe Marks, and they talk about the US president, like among his supporters, he's not seen as someone who's very truthful, but they really feel that they can trust him because he, in a lot of ways, he has delivered on what he said he would. He has tried to build a wall, he has lowered taxes, he has made it difficult for people from Muslim countries to get in here. So they, in a way, they don't mind his dishonesty, I think, if it's serving their cause. And I think that's true in general of dishonesty. It's not how we judge it is depending on what it's sort of doing for us. And I think that's probably true of media bias as well. Like, there's a whole field of motivated reasoning. In some ways, we probably quite enjoy reading media that we think is biased if it's biased in a direction that suits our, suits our a view of the world that we want to believe and buy into.
Audience metrics supports that view.
Yeah.
I mean, this is part of what's happened, is that the lowering of the barriers to entry have made it possible for media to specialize. And so if you just had, if you have 3 cable news networks, if you have to decide whether ABC goes left or right, you lose half your audience. But now you can be the left-wing outlet, or you can be the right-wing outlet, or you can be the, Housewives in Arkansas outlet, right? We're in an era of niche media, which has led to a proliferation of choice in terms of political orientation.
It's interesting from the law side. So our Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior thinks a lot about the role of new science and technology in helping potentially to achieve more truthful and just outcomes. I think one of the success stories in law is the introduction of DNA evidence over the last 15 to 20 years. And the precursor to that is to say that unlike some other fields where there is, I think, a sense that the goal is if it goes into print, it's as best you can do the truth, I suspect, right? We take an adversarial model in the law, and we teach our students to write a persuasive set of facts. And sure, when you're in front, Marty, you tell facts and the other side tells facts, and they're honest, and yet listening to them, it sounds like two completely different things happen. And we actually embrace that, and the idea is that we'll have it out, proceed with these procedural rules in the courtroom, and that the fact finder will have to sort of sift between the two. It'd be the equivalent of saying you have to sit for an hour and watch Fox News, an hour and watch MSNBC, and then you make your decision. One other interesting thing about law, I was thinking about it when you were mentioning anonymous sourcing, it's really the opposite in law, and especially in a criminal case where there's something called a front confrontation clause, a right to confront your accuser and look your accuser in the eyes. It's one of the problems when a witness dies, a key witness dies, you often can't go forward with the case because that person has to appear in the courtroom. It's a really interesting way to get at truth. And I'll just leave you with this quote. It comes from a Supreme Court case on the issue that had to do with whether or not we should introduce the polygraph into court proceedings. The polygraph, by the way, is used routinely in police investigations, but it's not typically admissible in the courtroom. And Justice Thomas said, the jury is the lie detector. It's an interesting thing to think about.
Jury is the lie detector.
The jury is the lie detector. That's
Let
right.
me just say with reference to that, what I do is I try jury cases. So I've, let's say, tried hundreds of them. And one of the most interesting explorations is speaking to a jury after you've tried a case and seeing what they heard and what they evaluated. And it's a place in the country where the people are relatively responsible for their own lives within government. And they can make important decisions about their lives. And they are entrusted with the responsibility of making decisions, particularly about the lives or deaths of people who are before them. So you have this creation of a truth-seeking system, which is as good as anything else, and the extent to which it's perverted or supported is fascinating. And the ways in which you learn to support it or pervert it is fascinating.
How much of the social networks, how much influence does that have? I'll be biased in asking the question this way, in perverting that effort to sort of establish the truth widely.
Well, juries come in with extraordinary biases. Your job as a lawyer is to find out those people whose biases are yours, the ones you want. Your job as a lawyer is to find out which people you can influence, either by being truthful or untruthful. So the effect of the media is in there every second of every court day. I tried a case recently in Miami involving Cubans and the politics in Miami. So we had to, and I represented someone in New York years ago called Kathy Boudin, which was a murder case which was a murder case years ago. And the question of trying to rid the jury of biases. A fascinating thing, I'll just tell you one story. There was a case at Harrisburg, and it happened to be something called the Berrigan case, which was tried a long time ago. It was priests who had put blood on weapons of war, and they were being prosecuted. And one of the jurors was a woman whose son had been jailed because she believed, the sons believed, as the defendants in this case, that the war was horrible and there are certain things you should do with respect to it. So she was the perfect juror for us. And we did everything we could to keep her on, and they did everything they could to knock her off. At the end of the case, the defendants were convicted, in large part because of this woman. And we then sat down with her, and she was gracious enough to allow us to have her examined by psychiatrists. And what really happened is that she was furious at these defendants because her son was in jail.
think coming back to your sort of question about social media, I think one sort of problematic aspect of it is it just is making sort of spreading dishonesty easier, right? Like in lots of different ways. So coming back to this idea of emotion, if I'm actually being dishonest to someone in person, I'm going to probably feel quite bad about that. But if I can do it through a click of a button, it's sort of much more indirect. It's much further removed.
That's a good point.
And one of the other interesting things is that often dishonest information seems to spread quicker than true information. I think part of the reason for that is often it's it's more sensational, it's more novel, so it propagates through things like Twitter much faster than true information.
So in many instances, sort of justice seems to trump what's true about something, let's say. Or people are motivated by thinking that they're following some path of justice, and that sort of means biasing or telling a little falsehood may not be so bad after all.
A little story again. In Anatomy of Murder, a film some of you may remember, the man walks in to see the lawyer, and he says, "I killed so-and-so." And the lawyer then says to him, "I killed my wife, I killed my girlfriend." So the lawyer then says to him, "Well, listen, if you come in and say that you picked up a gun and you were angry and you killed this woman, your wife, your girlfriend, you will be convicted and sentenced to die. If you come in and tell us that you were upset, you had totally lost any sense of sanity, that morning you tried to fly to the roof, and you tell us that story, and if you come in, you will be found not guilty by reason of insanity." So the lawyer then says, "Come in tomorrow and tell me what happened." Talking about truth in the legal system and the different ways you deal with it.
But you're trying cases, right? You are in the service of a defendant and your legal duty is to help them win their case. What about the judge in this? What's their duty or their obligation?
Is the legal duty to win the case? Is the legal duty to truth? Is the legal duty to be in a legal system that values truth? Is it my duty to participate in a system that undermines truth? And the question is, what are the values? It can't merely be to get people off, or can it be? So I think that's an interesting issue. My friend here mentioned Elizabeth Loftus. Elizabeth Loftus spent years trying to determine how people saw truth. And, what she said, and it's a Bible in the law, is they see it as they want or as their influence. So what happens if you have a legal system where truth is fundamentally irrelevant?
That's a dark thought to me.
I put it on the table.
But you would agree that the judge has a different responsibility than the lawyer who's representing a client?
No judge doesn't have a system of bias. No judge. In other words, the concept of the United States Supreme Court years ago is that these were people who had a sense of the law, and they made their judgments based on the law, free from bias. Most people no longer believe that, if they believed it long ago. If you look at the law back in 1810, 1850, and you look at the Constitution, which says this or that about slavery, you no longer believe that anybody is making judgments free of bias. Now, I was with a law professor who had written eloquently about justice and truth in the law. Very respected. He taught at Oxford, taught at NYU. After Bush against Gore came out, he threw it all away.
Can't hear you.
After Bush against Gore, he threw it all away. He became persuaded that truth was not the issue, that there were other things determining that decision.
Well, so that means there's no way to determine whether someone's biased, very biased, a little biased, or hardly biased. I mean, in other words, there are degrees of bias, and that there are characters who demonstrate their equanimity before the truth.
Right, and the illusion I think that we've given up, and it relates to the question you were talking about, the question you asked, is a judge is free of bias and he's committed to the law. Nonsense.
I would like to stay on the subject but change it slightly in the question of being free of bias and impartial, and how do you assess things. I have done a lot of work with children of divorce, where it's a pretty acrimonious situation. And there you're trying to be witness, jury, judge, sort of, because each of the parents gives you a very brainwashed version of their side, because I'm talking about, not about peaceful divorces, I'm talking about situations where the kids are really caught in the middle of World War III. And so you, as the advocate of the child, and I've never gone to court, this is not about going to court, it's about helping and protecting the best interest of the child. You'll get two different versions of the truth, and if it's highly intelligent, high-functioning people, they can be extraordinarily convincing and persuasive. You find out the worst possible things about each other, and it's perplexing, because when you talk to one parent, they convince you of their point of view, and you're saying, oh, okay. Then you talk to the other parent, they convince you of their point of view, you're saying, well, wait a minute, now which is the truth? And then you say, this is what life is like for this poor child. All the time they're being torn back and forth. How does a child like this develop a cohesive sense of integrity, of values, of knowing right from wrong, of figuring out who to trust and what to trust, if the two people in their life that they love and would like to trust are at war and telling such terrible things about each other with such conviction? And it could go down the line, whether it's about visitation, about how much the kids should be studying, how strict or loose, how much time they should get on the media, you name it. It's war. And so it's a very interesting window, in a way, a painful one, to see what, the divorce rate is like 50%, what so many children grow up with, and then how do they figure out their values? Now, of course, it depends on how old the kid was when the war started, but the war often started long before the divorce, it continues afterward, etc. So I have to tell you that even as a grown-up, it's very difficult, but it's certainly super stressful for the kids. So this whole question about how do people develop into good judges with good values and try to figure out what authorities to trust, all of that gets formed through one's development. And I think we have such a breakdown, in a way, of cohesive standards, not only in journalism, but in so many different settings, starting with childhood. So this is kind of a plea for peaceful divorces.
If I could just interject as well, and you raised the question, I think to some extent it gets at, can you ever really discern the truth, or you just have to throw your hands up? And I do want to make clear that there are a lot of efforts from the clinical side and on the legal side to gather additional information rigorously and systematically with which to evaluate claims. And this is, say, on the clinical side, if you're treating someone, you actually want to know how many times did this happen. We've typically relied on self-report. Well, the future is digital phenotyping, collecting that data. In the situation you asked, you've got two, different stories. Well, you go out and you get a bunch of extra evidence. In your world, right, you get additional sources. You get, and in law, we're trying to systematize that. And specifically about judges, it's not just that they're biased, but they're biased based on empirical evidence in knowable and predictable ways. And if you know that systematically, you can then suggest interventions that won't take care of every single case, but will, and the same thing in a corporate world, right, where you can begin to recognize what your systemic biases are and adjust. And I'd say on the hopeful side, I think there's some slow progress there. It doesn't solve sort of the underlying human nature we've brought up several times, but it begins based on the collective research to say, okay, we know at broad level, here are some things that are happening. At a system level, can we put in some safeguards that will, for instance, in the judge, stop and think? If we have a quick emotional response, should we require that you don't give your opinion now, but you deliberate for an hour, as one example? And there are others.
It seems to me, in a way, in law, you most of the time are deciding, or not deciding, but the law is supposed to be deciding, is this person telling the truth about not having stolen something, or not having embezzled something, or not having killed somebody. But in human relations, it's different, because what you are, in a way, doing, you are constantly having to interpret, and your interpretation may be wrong. So you may think, in a couple who are fighting, that my husband is a liar, but in fact he isn't. It's just how you interpret his behavior, and vice versa. So it creates such a lack of clarity about, especially in psychology and human relations, what lying and truth is about.
I have a question for everybody. What about people who lie for sport? Kind of confabulators, like to make up stories. Would you like to address that subject a little bit?
Can you give an example?
Think of one.
Okay.
I'm joking. I mean, the obvious one. The president.
Oh, but in sport though.
What?
No, I didn't mean
you mean
sports.
you mean people who are like
For
sociopaths?
sport, for fun.
Oh,
For fun.
I see.
As a way of creating an impression, or because it's pleasurable to deceive, it's pleasurable to fool
No,
people.
but it's also part
Yeah.
of certain mental illness, as well as sometimes
Well,
it's
that's
part
what- yeah.
of deterioration of the brain, where the person keeps inventing things which people
Confabulation,
know it's not
yeah.
correct, but the person keeps inventing them to create a narrative. And I think there is this issue of people lying or borderline lying in order to create a narrative for themselves about their lives, their past, their aims, their goals, etc.
So I think it's a very important topic, because it addresses the question of motivation. I mean, before we were talking about legal matters. Okay, someone's fighting for their life. But what about people who just routinely confabulate and make things up and exaggerate and so forth and so on? And sometimes people like that actually go to seek help because it's compulsive and they can't stop themselves and they run into trouble. But of course, it's very challenging to treat people like that as a clinician, because they put you in a situation where you never know if they're lying or not to you, or they tell you stories about, I fooled this one and I told that one that, and so forth and so on. So it puts you then in a position of either you're like the moralist, in which case you become the enemy, or how are you going to help them figure it all out about why they're doing it, or how to stop it, etc. It's an interesting kind of question. So I was just curious what your experience is with any of that.
I mean, I've encountered such people. It took me quite a few months the first time I encountered such a person to understand that that's what they were, and that such a thing existed. I like to believe I've gotten faster at it. I feel like one of those things those experiences have taught me is how little consistency is actually required to be convincing. You know, we have this idea that, you know, one of the drawbacks of lying is then you got to keep your story straight, which is true, but it's actually not that hard to just, oh, I thought I said something out, or gaslighting. No, that's not what I said at all, or that's not what I meant, or that's not a relevant fact, because even though you saw me steal this thing, what was actually happening is that I was pressured into it because, you know, and when you deal with these people, you see these incredible, often very charismatic, manipulative. It's hard to do it justice. But to me, what the existence of such people and their ability to operate says is that we actually are relatively poor at enforcing epistemic norms, right? We're actually pretty bad at making people be self-consistent, although we often have a sense, right? We often know something is wrong. And I think the process of encountering these people multiple times is to develop that sense and to learn to trust it.
Do you remember that play, 6 Degrees of Separation?
Mm-hmm.
Was this guy who was insinuated himself into all kinds of situations and got away with it for the longest time?
Oh, I'm fascinated by con men. It's such a crazy topic.
So, okay, so that's an extreme case. But then we have situations of people who are just a little bit con men-y. And what's that like? We don't see them too often in the consulting room, but occasionally we do. And then it's really scary.
I feel like the especially tricky case is when someone with that personality bent is telling you about an injustice that was done to them. And then you're in the challenging position of trying to understand to what extent do you believe their version of this story, which I'm sure you must have encountered.
But it kind of goes back to the question we started with, right? So most people think, right, what distinguishes a good or a bad lie in terms of the moral sense is if it helps or harms others. And a lot of the fibbing, the impression management, the fooling is not directly harming an identified person. It's very easy to believe this is in sport and, right, people with a normal psychological profile really care about harm. What we care about is harming others. And so in the absence of evidence that I'm directly harming someone, it's quite easy to believe that I'm not actually doing anything wrong. And you guys both brought up this interesting example of, right, like the con man. I think something that makes it more complicated is we do actually have this admirable narrative of people who are really good at deception. And, right, as kids again, right, we read stories of the Wile E. Coyote, right? Like these characters who are able to do great things through deceiving others in clever ways, the trickster.
Ulysses.
Right. And so there's this other part of deception going through everyone's head that is like, there's good stuff here if I can't see the harm. And that probably makes it easy to keep going.
Yeah, I think that's just to relate it maybe to learning as well. We know that, a powerful mechanism for learning is, what's the consequence? If I just go out and steal something, I'm going to get punished there and then, so it's pretty clear that I shouldn't do that. But with the sort of cases you're telling about where it's sort of, ongoing, little lies here, little lies there, you can't instantly see what the consequence is on that person, and that consequence might come quite far down the line as well, so it's quite hard to sort of tie it to your actions. So maybe that lack of learning is what allows it to continue, perhaps.
Well, either lack of learning or learning that it works.
All that as well, yeah. Also getting like positive reinforcement from it, maybe as well, yeah.
One of the interesting things developmentally is that very little kids, let's say 5 or under, more or less, they think that their parents practically read their minds. They think that the parents know everything that's going on. So if they do something they shouldn't and they get caught, they're not surprised because they kind of assume that their mom and dad kind of knew in the first place. There's this fantasy of parents being so omnipotent. And it's kind of a major developmental step in sort of separation and developing one's identity to know that, in fact, if you say something that's not true, maybe they don't know. And, you kind of left your own devices on your own, but you can do that. So then how do people decide, after all, that they should be truthful? It has something to do with what we call superego formation. In other words, people feel like they want to be loved and they want to be just like their parents, upright citizens, if they come from that kind of a family. So there's a whole story about that, about who your models are, and that it's you're going to love yourself if you're being kind of truthful and honest to yourself, and you're going to feel ashamed and guilty and not like yourself if you lie, etc. Very basic stuff. but it's something that develops gradually. And then what we call, sort of beginnings of latency at the age where in all cultures people go to school and so on, they get very clear rules of what are the rules of that culture. And then they have a sense of belonging to the community if they obey the rules. So there's a lot of incentive for socialization, both from the family and from the community, to be a good citizen. But there are often situations where that development is faulty because, let's say, the parents are doing something deceitful, like one of the parents is having an affair and says, don't tell dad or whatever, and then the kid doesn't know what to think anymore, and so that this what should be a very solid sense of right and wrong gets bent and twisted, and the rest is history as to what then happens with that. So in our work as analysts, we try to go back and understand something about the origins of some of these lesions in one's sense of integrity, which are manifold.
I think all of us, keeping in line with these comments, most of us can seem to be able to appreciate pretty well, I guess because we've all lied to some degree, what the incentives there are to telling a falsehood, and that it may be adaptive in certain instances. It may be con men, for example, and they do unfortunately tend to be men more often than women, not exclusively. There's Elizabeth Holmes, but men seem to lead the pack when it comes to that. Anyway, there's a new idea, I believe the anthropologist's name is Richard Wrangham, his last name is Wrangham, who's written about the self-domestication of the human race, I guess. And in it, he said that there was a sort of a movement towards trying to get rid of the more aggressive, violent, but also lying and cheating members of the group, of the tribe. And this was a way of pushing back against that type that may be selected to a degree, the con man type who may have been selected. So again, I'm going back to my feeling about being unbiased. There are some pressures and incentives towards being unbiased. And I think that's sort of what Wrangham was trying to bring out in this new book about self-domestication. So I wonder, is that in this sort of skepticism or this sort of general pessimism about bias, don't we believe there are incentives? You mentioned, Anna, trying to live up to the ideal of your parents, assuming your parents are honest people. Aren't there incentives to being fair and honest, even when it's a challenge to you personally?
I mean, certainly there are such incentives embedded in the professional structure of journalism, which I think actually surprises many people. Journalism turned out to be more idealistic than I thought it would be, actually. But there are both internal incentives in terms of norms and standards. And, I sometimes think of Columbia Journalism School as this cathedral of journalism, right? It's this big old building and there's plaques on the walls and it's got the Pulitzer Prizes, right? It functions as a cathedral. It's like this sort of awe-inspiring symbol. But there's also just reputation, right? If you're wrong too many times, you have trashed your credibility. Unfortunately, the flip side of that is that it means also, as a public information source or a public figure, you are subject to political attacks. So, I mean, that's part of what is happening now, is there are enormous political attacks on the press, which is, certainly not new in a world historical sense, but is relatively new in this country.
I mean, you could make a case for dishonesty being good in some cases as well, right? In World War II, Churchill would lie about how well we were doing, in the war, and that was to, really encourage us to keep going, and that's true with individual cases of optimism as well. It's quite good if you get rejected from a job interview or asking someone out for a date, to really believe that next time, it's going to be successful. So, sort of delusion at different levels can be a good thing in certain cases, I think. Yeah.
Look, if you are a psychoanalyst like I am, if you go to a party and there's a patient of yours there, you are not going to shake the hands and tell everybody, oh, here's my patient. Mm-hmm. You're going to keep quiet about it. Right. You may not even acknowledge the patient in order not to create any problems with issues of confidentiality. So you are being deceitful, you are not
Discretion.
actively lying, but you have to. And there are many situations where one has, in a way, there is no other way but. So I realize that there's this whole moral component and there's this whole area of terrible to lie, but there's also a usefulness to it. The question is, how does one really distinguish between these? And is it only based on the outcome, on the motivation? What makes the difference? And then there are all degrees of lying. For example, we all enjoy being deceived by a magician. We know he's deceiving, we know he or she, and yet we have tremendous enjoyment from it. So there are all these complexities having to do with neuroscience, which I think perhaps we don't fully understand, that have to do with this phenomenon we call lying.
A lot of the judgment is also culturally bound. So in the U.S., we believe in autonomy, we believe in knowledge, right? Obviously, there's some variance in that from person to person and different personality traits and political leanings. But mostly, we're a country that believes in autonomy, or the culture here. So I should have knowledge for self-governance, and that's part of the reason that honesty is so important. But that's not true everywhere, right? So in Eastern Asian cultures, right, dignity and authority are more important than necessarily self-knowledge. So, right, it's not as if the whole world is living in this debate that, right, should we be telling the truth? In a lot of other cultures, they're saying, no, we shouldn't always be telling the truth, right? So medicine's an example. So I've done studies in oncology units, and in the U.S., actually, a lot of patients want more false hope than their doctors are willing to give them. But in China, it's very common to get false hope, and that's part of the expectation. We could argue whether that's normatively good or normatively bad, but there's certainly lots of different beliefs, aside from the belief that truthfulness is what should be guiding most of our behavior.
There's a movie about that.
Yeah,
very
The
topic.
Farewell. Yeah.
What's the movie?
The Farewell.
Farewell.
Yeah, about the difference between how that's handled, the truth about a medical prognosis is handled in China versus a U.S.
It does raise a question about how much we want to know about ourselves. There's both a medical question. One specific example is increasingly we're able, through brain and blood biomarkers and genetic information, to determine one's probabilistic likelihood of developing Alzheimer's and other dementia. And the country and other populations roughly split 50-50. 50% of people say, I want to know because I want to plan, so forth. The other 50% say, given that we don't have a cure right now, don't tell me. But there's a deeper way in which we have to ask ourselves, do we really want to know who we are? Right? And this is in part when we say, you've got to go to some counseling. Why? Because you're not seeing who you are, how angry you are, how narcissistic, or you're not seeing what you are as a parent. And that's a really challenging question. Do we want to know how much of the whole truth? That was very difficult for myself, certainly. I think for many of us. But it gets started, I think, at this question. Again, this was a medical one. It's almost easier sometimes to compartmentalize. What about me as a husband, as a father, as a friend, as a colleague? How well did I actually do that? Right? It's challenging to confront that. Maybe more challenging than what we do in law.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you, everyone. I think it's time we could have a few of the audience members ask questions. If you line up back here, I'm sure our panelists would be happy to respond.
Maybe that's a lot of questions.
This is a question for everyone on the panel. When is the time that each one of you lied, and reflecting back on that will tell that lie again?
I'll answer that. I was thinking about telling this earlier. So my brother and I were 2 years apart. We look kind of similar, so much so that when we go out, and we recently celebrated our joint 40th birthday, he's 39, I'm 41, he said, this is the year we're both 40. And a lot of people said, that's great. We wore the same clothes, these Elvis costumes. Are you twins? Yeah, we're twins. It's our birth. And we said that all night. And after a while, we're like, let's see what can we add to the story, you know? We're not from Hawaii. We're from Hawaii, and all this kind of stuff. Would I do it again if I turned 40 again? Absolutely. It was great. Everyone got a kick out of it. You know, going to your question, I don't think anyone was irreparably harmed. Yeah. I don't know how we were intentional about it. It was not true.
That's a good one. We'll just go for one beer.
I created a system of lies at the border. I would do it again.
What?
I created a system of lies at the border representing immigrants trying to come into the country, and I would do it again.
Where's the
You were
lie?
saying it here in public.
Pardon me?
You were saying it here in public.
Yes.
I'm having trouble coming up with one I told, although I'm sure I have. But I can recall like circumstances in which I was grateful being lied to. So I was planning my wedding the first year of graduate school when I was preparing for my qualifying exam. My grandfather wanted to invite all of his friends to my wedding, which we didn't have space for, like totally wasn't feasible. We didn't even have enough invitations for them. My mother said, don't worry, like you study, I got this, we're not gonna invite them. I found out like the day before my wedding that she had photocopied my wedding invitations and sent them to all of my grandfather's friends who she knew wouldn't come, right? She knew that like, this is gonna be the easiest thing. I'm not gonna be harmed. I'm going to be able to live in my bubble and not stressed about my wedding. And I'm very grateful that she pulled it off.
So my comment/question is more about, as a physician, and sort of the sense of knowing sometimes when the patient's not telling the truth, and the search for the truth to prove that the patient's not telling the truth, like patients with pseudo seizures or fictitious disorder, malingering, and how sometimes just the sense that as humans, sometimes we feel that sense when we're not being told the truth, even when we could even have clinical evidence, in like fictitious disorder, that it's not true. And we search for some sort of inconsistency, or sometimes we really can't find it. So I often think of that, because we really trust that what the patient's telling us is true.
Well, maybe I'm also at part-time a neuropsychiatrist. So that's a joke. I am a neuropsychiatrist, but full-time. And I've treated people with pseudo seizures and fictitious illness. And I think the answer is very simple. It's just that I think that as a physician, you have to not feel offended and angry that the person's been deceiving you. Often they don't know or why they're deceiving you. And so being disarmed, not feeling angry with the patient, it seems to me to be pretty easy just to say, well, you're not having real epilepsy. You don't have real epilepsy, or this isn't a real illness. And patients respond incredibly well to that, I find. I haven't had patients who've come to me with those sorts of problems leave because I said, I don't believe this is a real, the diagnosis you think it may be.
And
just being honest.
Last thing. To the lawyers or the legal people, is the Amitol interview ever used in legal cases? Truth serum, as it's called.
Is truth serum ever used? Not in the United States. It has been used in the last few years in India in some cases. There have been 2 cases of brain-based, MRI-based lie detection where that was proffered in both a state case in Maryland and a federal case in Tennessee. It was excluded. And there are some other types of technologies that are being proffered. They're not yet ready. For another day, there's a discussion about if we have this panel in 20 years, if some of those technologies have come into the courtroom.
But is polygraph still used in U.S. courts?
The polygraph is used extensively in the investigation phase, but it's not typically allowed. It's typically excluded in the guilt phase, in the courtroom phase. It's also used sometimes in some probation and parole considerations, for instance, with sex offenders, if they're determined if they're ready to go back to society.
It's partly comment, partly question. First, I would like to say, let's be honest. Truth is not very entertaining. What about literature? What about art? What about creativity? It's all established on lies.
What's the question?
It's question. I'm saying that it's partly question, partly comment. And
No, just confused.
yes, thank you. Okay. And in American society, when I came here 25 years ago, I started to learn that deception, for example, advertising, it's probably most most obvious than probably in any other societies. You have to learn deception. What we right now see in our White House, we see that guy who obviously lying, and it's kind of very entertaining for both sides. Hillary is not that entertaining at all. And from one side, is like, I'm outraged. From other side, he said what I was thinking for a long time. So it's kind of, we have this entertainment, and it's, and he probably won because of that he is good in lying and Hillary is not. Hillary is not good in lying, everybody agree. So could you please say that what about all these areas like advertisement, literature, arts in general, where we should put them, what their role in our society?
Mm-hmm. I would make a very big distinction between art and literature and advertisement. Because advertisement is to, unless you say that art and literature is to sell its own product, but it's considered fabrication or fiction, whereas advertisement is trying to sell something and to embellish it for purpose of selling it. But I think the whole question of lying and fabrications and art is a very interesting spectrum, because a really good impersonator or one of these people who's a practiced liar is kind of an artist. They have the finesse and the ability to create illusion and so forth. So there's a kinship with artists. And Thomas Mann is somebody who was very, very interested in this issue, and he's written some interesting things about it. One of them is a novel called Felix Krull, The Adventures of Felix Krull, and it's based on the memoirs of somebody who was a very famous, of all things, Romanian swindler. And I'm saying of all things because I'm from Romania. And he was fascinated by this. The name of the swindler was different, but in the Thomas Mann story, he worked on this novel on and off for many years till the end of his life, and I don't think he even finished it, because this guy was able to impersonate so many people and rob hotels and so forth. He was quite a swindler. There's another story by Thomas Mann called Tonio Kroger. It's a short story in which the main character is kind of torn between being a businessman and an artist, because his father was a businessman, his mother was artistic, and he could never quite find his footing anywhere, but he's mostly an artist. And in it, he's fascinated by the whole question of what does it take to be an artist compared to kind of a square, conventional, super straight type of guy. And how come he couldn't find his place in a super straight world? And maybe to be an artist, you have to be a little outside of things, an outsider, to be able to describe things, and therefore already not adhering to the rules of the community. So I don't know if this addresses what you're asking, but I've thought about it in the context of this, preparing for the round table.
So on that subject of deception and versus an honest person, why is it that in literature and in theater, the most fascinating characters are the bad guys?
Absolutely. Okay, anybody comment?
Yes, in law also, no?
Yes, I think the bad guys have the characteristics Well, the answer is yes. I won't go into the other stuff. Yes. You asked about whether it's in law, and I said yes.
I think it's related to the issue of it seems, because I think the final research in this is not clear, but it looks as though falsehoods, as you were mentioning earlier, spreads faster than truth, and it's more sensational. So that's a simple version of why I think these stories, and also I think there's a certain tension when someone's telling a lie, and typically as part of some work of literature or stage production, you're aware there's this tension as an audience, and that creates tension in you, and then what's going to happen next, right? So I think that sort of generates a lot of interest in lying.
That's
That's
good.
Yeah, link to that. I think.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that explanation, that it creates a tension, because actually the essence of theater is conflict. So if it's everybody agree, yeah, we all agree, it's not interesting. The fact that you disagree, the fact that it's not so simple, the complexity, I think, is what draws us to the facets.
Yeah, link to that. I think we often aren't actually that fascinated with people that are purely evil. What we really like is people that are sort of essentially good, but a bit flawed. And that might be because that's basically like us, right? Like, we want to be seen as these good people, but we do have these sort of weaknesses. You know, we do lie, like most days, to some degree. So maybe it resonates with us, those types of characters. I don't know.
When you had spoken about adultery and children in conflicted families, I immediately was thinking of all these fabulous characters like Madame Bovary, and just the literature really is not made up of goody-goody housewives. It's the ones that, are peeking through the blinds. And your explanation of, why we're more interested, because it creates a tension. I think you really hit on something.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, you want to add some more?
Thank you. So many things occurred to me. I really was thinking about sort of the demise of religion and these kind of strong value systems, and maybe the rise and acceptance of lying. That was one thing that occurred to me. But on a bigger scale, I'm wondering whether the fact that there seem to be no repercussions and no punishment for lying on sort of a governmental scale, on corporate scale, whether you think of cover-ups or whether you think of our president sort of being able to lie with kind of nothing's been done about it. I mean, he hasn't been impeached. He hasn't, there's no punishment. And what you see, I think of the clergy and all those cover-ups, and sort of the lack of punishment for lying, what you see as a long-term outlook for our democracy, where lying is just kind of accepted on a leadership level.
I said there's allegedly a legal system that is supposed to deal with a lot of this.
Yeah, I mean, my field is in the business of accountability, right? So, I mean, I would say that there have been consequences, maybe not the consequences there should have been or the consequences you would have preferred. So I'll take a very concrete, specific one, which is that Facebook collaborates with a number of fact-checking organizations. And if a fact-checking organization rates an article as substantially false, they will reduce the distribution of it on Facebook. And apparently, Facebook says you lose 80% of your reach if a fact-checker tags you as false. So that's a very concrete economic hit for being labeled as a lie.
They could do more, though, right? As well, I think you could have some rating of information, like potentially.
Oh yeah, let's do this for another 90 minutes.
Yeah.
We can go into. I mean, I thought I was actually going to be asked to talk about all the disinformation world.
Yeah, tell us.
Oh,
in the next 5 minutes.
I think we're a little late for a long explanation, but suffice it to say that all of the major social media platforms are deep in this issue. And it's a difficult issue, in part because it is an issue of who gets to decide. So it's inextricably political, it's inextricably legal as well, because if you have a global company, whose standards do you use? Or do you show different people in different countries different things, which has its own implications and problems? So it's not at all a simple question. And then there's the actual, how do you decide if something is a lie? And the platforms have mostly fallen back on essentially journalistic fact-checking organizations, which use a essentially open-ended variety of methods to try to verify things. You know, you'll interview sources, you'll compare pictures, you'll do technical analyses of the sources of a piece of information. I mean, it's research in the broadest sense, and anything is fair game. And the idea is to try to produce these consequences, right? And in the sort of immediate sense, as in this article is false, and in the broader sense, as in, you know, we did this investigation and we concluded that, you know, somebody is embezzling money, or I think the sex scandals in the Catholic Church are actually a prime example of the role of journalism in democracy, right? There is a movie about this.
Yes, we saw that's an excellent movie.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I understand if you're pessimistic, but I don't think it's fair to say that there are no consequences.
Well, I want to thank everyone for their contribution today, and that's, oh, you have one more question? Is that, we need it.
We need the microphone.
Otherwise,
okay. You don't.
I know a guy really wanted a job, so he applies, does the interview, and he tells the interviewer, I can't work on the Sabbath. The interviewer says, okay, you're hired. What he doesn't say, and I said to him, why didn't you tell the interviewer that you also don't want to work on the religious holidays, which will come in 6 months? And then he said, well, they won't give me the job. Okay. He had already been fired and sued on a different job that he had before because he sprung this on that company. I can't work on the Jewish holidays. And he was fired from that job. So he had some experience with this. Then I said, well, what would happen if they hired you on this job you're now applying for? Oh, by the way, on that first job, he won $20,000 in court for religious intolerance. So he said to me, I would sue them. And I said, you know, you're a fucking liar. And I throw it out to you. I don't know the outcome of...
Is he a relative?
The answer to that is yes.
I'm sorry.
I could actually embellish that, but I won't. I think I've done enough.
Sorry.
I think I've done enough.
I'm sorry that you have a relative who's this.
I'll just say I think you told the truth. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's all.
How do you know that techniques like